Once again, Christian greetings to all our valued listeners and viewers throughout the whole world. Even more particularly to all Shepherd's Rod believers, and most especially to our beloved brothers and sisters in the United States of America. Special greetings to our brethren in Colorado, our brethren in Georgia, our brethren in Kansas, in Texas, in Missouri, in Chicago, Illinois, in Fiji Island, in Mexico, Spain, in Africa, in Pakistan, Kenya, Zambia, to the United Kingdom, to our brethren in Australia, and also to our brethren in Malaysia. Good evening, and may the good Lord bless you, brothers and sisters. And also to all our brethren, the 144,000 living saints scattered abroad. Greetings. This is our episode number 12 on the subject, the opening of the seventh seal. Now, at this time, I would like to focus our attention to Matthew 25 from verses 1 to verse 13. So I would like to begin on track number 3 on page 47 and page 48. It says, inescapably, therefore, the Lord's coming to His temple, in Malachi 3 verse 1 to 3, His coming with all His angels, Matthew 25, and His coming enthroned above the living creatures, Ezekiel chapter 1. All three representing the same event, as has been shown, take place at the beginning of the judgment of the living. The time in which the judicial activities of the heavenly sanctuary extend to the earthly sanctuary, the church. So, the Shepherd's Rod made it so plain that Malachi 3 verse 1 to 3, as well as Matthew 25 and Ezekiel chapter 1. It says all these three represents the same event, and that is at the beginning of the judgment of the living, the time in which the judicial activities of the heavenly sanctuary extend to the earthly sanctuary, the church. So let us now study closely, brothers and sisters, concerning these three prophetic verses, Malachi 3 verse 1 to 3, Matthew 25, and Ezekiel chapter 1. Now, I think it is more clearer if we will dwell our attention to Ezekiel chapter 1. Because Ezekiel chapter 1, there is a particular object in view. And I think there is a single fulfillment of Ezekiel chapter 1. And since Malachi 3 verse 1 to 3 and Matthew 25, as well as Ezekiel 9, all these three represents the same event. So if we could be able to ascertain clearly Ezekiel chapter 1, then it will be even more easier to locate Malachi 3 verse 1 to 3 and Matthew 25. Now let us read track number 1. Let's read track number 1 on page 5. The call of Ezekiel to the prophetic office is one of the most interesting experiences of the ancient seers. And the revelation of what he saw by the river Chebar is perhaps of greater importance to heaven and earth at this time than is any other vision on sacred record, because in a remarkable way, it reveals that which unites heaven with earth, even as the Dardanelles link two important seas. Thus, this study of Ezekiel's vision, which brings to light earth being visited by the majesty of the universe, may aptly be termed the Dardanelles of the Bible. So, this paragraph plainly telling us that the fulfillment of Ezekiel chapter 1 is the time when the earth will be visited by the majesty of the universe. And we know that is the glory of the Lord. That is Jesus Christ. When this earth will be visited by Jesus Christ, by which at that time there is a complete connection between heaven and earth, as illustrated by the Dardanelles that link two seas. Now, let's go back again, the statement. In track number 1. On page 5 it says, so let's read this statement. Because in a remarkable way, it reveals that which unites heaven with earth. So the statement unites heaven with earth, that is also the same with the vision of Sister White saying, there is a complete connection between heaven and earth. Even as the Dardanelles link two important seas. So, it says that illustrated by the Dardanelles link two important seas. Now, let us read again that statement in track number 1 on page 12. It says, Plainly, therefore, the vision was prophetic in Ezekiel's time and has been prophetic ever since. And if it is ever to be fulfilled and not remain a useless and unprofitable writing, a thing which God never creates, then its mystery must, of course, now be unveiled and its action executed in the near future. Then it says, in the clear light of these facts, chapter 9 is seen to hold the climactic scene of the vision. So chapter 9 is connected with the vision on chapter 1. But chapter 9 is the climactic scene of the vision, describing the awful work which the Lord is to do when, with the cherubim, he visits the earth. It shows the first-hand consequences to those who reject its message. Its blessings means the kingdom loss. Tragic, prideful experience, it shall be the fate of all who refuse now to awake and to know about it, but who choose rather to remain in ignorance of its truth and of the object of the Lord's coming in His throne. Track number 1 on page 12. The shepherd's rod made it so plain that of all the vision ever recorded in the Bible, this vision of Ezekiel on the river Chebar, brothers and sisters, is the most remarkable, because at that time the earth is being visited by the majesty of the universe. Now, I would like to read Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, on page 754. Volume 5, page 754. It says, the bright light going among the living creatures with the swiftness of lightning represents the speed with which this work will finally go forward to completion. He who slumbers not, who is continually at work for the accomplishment of his designs, can carry forward his great work harmoniously. That which appears to finite minds entangled and complicated, the Lord's hand can keep in perfect order. He can devise ways and means to thwart the purposes of wicked men, and He will bring to confusion the counsels of them that plot mischief against His people. Volume 5, page 754. So, the vision in Ezekiel chapter 1, according to this prophecy, the speed of a lightning. We know that light travels faster than sound. So, to repeat again, it says that bright light that came out from the 4 living creatures in Ezekiel chapter 1 represents the speed by which the work of the gospel will go forward to completion. So, and the voice of inspiration says that God never slumbers, and He can thwart the purposes of the wicked man. I remember the statement in Timely Greetings. It says here, 1 TG number 21, page 2. 1 TG number 21, page 2. It says, what shall we now pray for? I think we should pray to know that God, not man, is at the head of the work. To know that no man of himself can advance or thwart God's work. That only God Himself can do either. That we need not feel God's work is dependent upon us. That if we ever remember this, we shall have a closer walk with Him. This, I believe, is what we ought to pray for today. So, that statement is very plain that the work of salvation, no man of himself can advance or thwart God's work, even the devil. Only God can do such thing. And because of that, brethren, the statement here in 2 TG 23, page 13, it says, we can but put our heart and soul in the work, though and leave the results to God. If we ever had to be all out for God and none for self, it is now. So if we ever had to be all out for God and none for self, it is now. It is now the high time to surrender all to God. Total surrender. That is the statement in White House Recruiter on page 10. It says, to be sure, though the few who do arouse to make the total surrender which the hour demands, God will save from the conflagration to come. White House Recruiter on page 10. So we need to completely surrender, submit ourselves to the Almighty God, and leave all things into His omnipotent power, omniscience, brothers and sisters, presence. Now, let us go back again to our subject. Ezekiel chapter 1. But do not forget the statement we read in tract number 3, page 47 and page 48, that Ezekiel chapter 1, Malachi 3, verse 1 to 3, and Matthew 25. These three prophetic events are pointing to the same event. So, Ezekiel chapter 1, Matthew 25, as well as Malachi 3, verse 1 to 3. But our attention is focused to the parable in Matthew 25, verses 1 to verse 13. I would like to read 2 SR Here in 2SR page 181, 2SR 181, it says, observe that the 25th chapter is a continuation of the 24th. Mark the word then, meaning the time they fulfilled the prophetic words contained in verses 48 to verse 51 in Matthew 24. So, the word then, the meaning of that word is found on verses 48, 49, 50, and 51 in Matthew 24, according to the voice of inspiration. Now, let's read verse 48, verse 49, verse 50, and verse 51, in order for us to have a clear conception. Because our reading is very plain that the very first word in Matthew 25 verse 1 started with the word then. And accordingly, in 2SR 181, whatever the meaning of the word then is found on verse 48, verse 49, verse 50, and verse 51. Let us read. Verse 48. But, and if that evil servant shall say in his heart, my Lord delayeth his coming. So, the focal point in verse 48 is the evil servant. And the verse did not say, but and if that evil servant shall say in his mouth, but rather shall say in his heart. And no human being can be able to read the heart. Only God himself can read the heart. And the heart is very deceitful. And in Jeremiah, I remember, here it says, Jeremiah 17, verse 9 and verse 10. The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I try the reins, even to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. Jeremiah 17, verse 9 and verse 10. So, only God himself can read the heart. So, this verse 48 in Matthew 24, since it is God, it is Jesus Christ who declared it, it cannot be mistaken. That this evil servant, God read the heart of this evil servant, saying, my Lord delayeth his coming. Then verse 49, and it says, and shall begin to smite his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with the drunken. Verse 50, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of. Verse 51, and shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew 24, verse 48, 49, 50, and 51. So, verse 48, verse 49, verse 50, and verse 51, the last 4 verses in Matthew 24, is directly addressed to that evil and wicked servant. by which in his heart he is saying that the Lord delayeth his coming. And accordingly, because of that thought, because of that belief, he began to smite his fellow servants. Now, I would like to read a tract number 1 on page 29 and page 30. So let's read the statement. As the words which Ezekiel was to speak to his people were found in the book which he ate. The book can be none other than the Bible, from which comes the message culminating in joy, mourning, and woe. And a roll of a book was therein, and he spread it before me, and it was written within and without, and there was written therein lamentations, mourning, and woe. Ezekiel 2 verse 9 and verse 10. Then it says, Diorite in Bysijim, the slaughter in Ezekiel 9. And the was pronounced in the master's parables, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day, when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of, and shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites, there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then said the king to the servants, Bind him hand and foot, and take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew 24, verse 50 and 51, and Matthew 22, verse 13. Now here the shepherd's rod made it so plain that the climactic point of the vision of Ezekiel on chapter 1 is Diorite in Bysijim, the slaughter in Ezekiel 9. And we already read, brothers and sisters, in tract number 1, page 12, that the climactic event of the vision of Ezekiel, brothers and sisters, is pointing to Ezekiel chapter 9. That is the climactic point of the vision of Ezekiel on chapter 1, as stated in tract number 1, page 12. The same with the statement on pages 29 and 30 on tract number 1. That the was pronounced by the master in the parable in Matthew 24, brothers and sisters, is that pointing to the day of slaughter, by which that evil and wicked servant will not be aware of that day. Now, let us go back again to the statement in 2SR 181. The statement in 2SR 181 says that Matthew 25, the parable in Matthew 25, brothers and sisters, is connected to Matthew 24, verse 48, 49, 50, and 51. Because Matthew 25 begins with the word then, according to the shepherds, that indicates that the parable in Matthew 25 is a continuation in Matthew 24, by which the word then, the meaning, is found on verse 48, 49, 50, and 51. Now let us now study closely. Who are they? The servant and the fellow servants. In Matthew 24, verse 48, 49, 50, and 51. So I would like to read again the statement on 2SR 181. It says, observe that the 25th chapter is a continuation of the 24th. Mark the word then, meaning the time they fulfilled the prophetic words contained in verses 48 and 51. So, the word then, the meaning, brothers and sisters, is found on verse 48, 49, 50, and 51. The time by which Matthew 25, verse 1, will then be fulfilled. Now, let us now connect Matthew 25, verse 1, and Matthew 24, verse 48, 49, 50, and 51. Now, brothers and sisters, the shepherd's rod is very plain that whatever the meaning of the word then in Matthew 25, verse 1, the meaning is found on verse 48, verse 49, 50, and 51. What is the meaning of the word then? It says, at the time when that evil servant shall say in his heart, the Lord delayeth his coming. At the time by which that wicked and evil servant is smiting his fellow servants. In that period of time, brothers and sisters, Matthew 25, verse 1 will then be fulfilled. Now, remember, Matthew 25, verse 1, brothers and sisters, and Ezekiel chapter 1, pointing to the same event. What is that event? The earth is being visited by the majesty of the universe. Now, I would like to read 11 symbolic code, number 12, page 11. It says, Matthew 25, verse 1. This verse begins with the word then. 11 symbolic code, number 12, page 11. 11 symbolic code, number 12, page 11. It says, this verse begins with the word then, indicating that it takes place at the time the Lord comes. You see? It takes place at the time the Lord comes. As spoken of in the preceding verse. What is the preceding verse? Verse 51. So let us go back again to verse 51. Matthew 24, verse 51. It says, and shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So who is he? The evil servant, that wicked servant. Brothers and sisters, mentioned in Matthew 24, verse 48. It says, he is the one by which God shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. So, whoever this evil servant mentioned in verse 48, or wicked servant, it says here that God will appoint his portion with the hypocrites. Therefore, this evil servant are not they categorized as the hypocrites. Because it says, God will appoint his portion with the hypocrites. Therefore, the evil servant are not the hypocrites. Who are they? The hypocrites. Now let's read 2SR. So, to have a complete understanding, brothers and sisters, let us now read 2SR page 101. 2SR page 101. It says, I would like to read the last portion. The Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of, and shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites, with the heads of the beast. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew 24, verse 45 to verse 51. Who are they, the hypocrites? Because it was inscribed in plural form, beast. And of course, there are only two beasts, by which there are 7 heads. That is the leopard-like beast and the scarlet-colored beast. Let us focus first to the leopard-like beast. In that reading is very plain that the hypocrites represents the 7 heads of the leopard-like beast. They are the hypocrites. And heads represent ministry, as well as servant. Servant also represent ministry. Now, I would like to read 2SR on page 179, 2SR 179. The servant, let's read it. The servant singular, that shall begin to smite his fellow servants, plural, signifies the leadership, the angel of the church of the Laodiceans, those who have charge of the household. But the servants, plural, apply to the ministry under that leadership. By the unfaithfulness of that servants, the gospel has been delayed. The generation is about to pass, and the work, it says, and the work is years behind. Now, I would like to focus the attention that the term servant, singular, brothers and sisters, and the term servants, plural. So the servant, brothers and sisters, must be pointing to the highest official in that organization. And the servants are those ministers under that leadership. And of course, since they had been smitten, it must be pointing to those under that leadership that had been disfellowship. Brothers and sisters, that had been put out of their congregation. Now, since we already fully established that the servant in Matthew 24, verse 48 to 51, they are not the hypocrites. Who are they, the hypocrites? As stated by the shepherd's rod in 2 SR 101, they are the 7 heads on the leopard like this. And since the Seventh-day Adventist Church is one of the 7 heads of the leopard like this, therefore, the hypocrites must be applied to the leadership in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So that wicked servant, evil servant, cannot be the Seventh-day Adventist leadership in direct application. Why? It's so because they are not the hypocrites. The Bible, as well as the shepherd's rod, declared clearly that God will appoint His portion with the hypocrites, indicating that that servant, that evil servant, are not the leadership represented by the hypocrites. Now, I would like to read another statement in the shepherd's rod, and I would like to go back to 11 Symbolic Code number 12, page 11, after reading this statement. So let us read 1 TG, number 45. So 1 TG number 45. On page 12, 1 TG number 45, page 12, it says, we are to study the 66th chapter of Isaiah. In this chapter, the Lord speaks to 2 groups of servants. The servants up to the cleansing of the sanctuary, Daniel 8 verse 14, up to the judgment for the living, the purification of the church. Volume 5, Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5, page 80. The time in which they are found, inscribed in plural form. They are found smiting their fellow servants. So, the pronoun they must be applied to the servant. Because there is no other that smite their fellow servants except the servant in Matthew 24 verse 48. But here the shepherd's rod inscribe it in plural form. So in general term, brothers and sisters, the servant being in singular, just to indicate that they must be pointing, brothers and sisters, to the highest officials in that leadership, in that organization. But if you will read 2SR, it is even more clearer, brothers and sisters, that the servant mentioned there are the sinners in Zion. The who pronounced by the master is pointing to Zion. Now let us read 2SR 101. 2SR pages, page 100 and page 101. It says, if God's ideal is to bless the world through the medium of His church on earth, and they to whom the gospel for the world committed have left the ship and are serving the devil in the persons in themselves, where is the hope of the world? The only answer that can be given is, woe to the sinners in Zion, and to whom the woe is pronounced, to the sinners in Zion. And Zion represent headquarters. I would like to read White House Recruiter, page 53. Because Zion, that is the palace grounds. White House Recruiter, page 53. And it shall come to pass that he that is left in Zion at headquarters. What is Zion? Headquarters. Now, who are they? The Zion mentioned in that prophecy. Because they were smiting against each other. Brothers and sisters, truth is truth and sense is sense. 1 TG number 6, page 32. And let us have them both. At this present time, there is no other group of people by which they were smiting each other, by which the issue is headquarters, other than the Davidians. The main issue in this trouble by which they were smiting against each other is the headquarters. Because Zion represent headquarters. Now, no one can deny the fact that that is the present situation today, by which it was predicted beforehand that during that period of time, by which they were smiting against each other, the prophecy in Ezekiel chapter 1, the prophecy in Matthew 25 verse 1, the prophecy in Malachi 3 verse 1 to 3 will be fulfilled. Now, I would like to concentrate on 1 TG 45 page 12. Let us read the statement. It says, we are to study the 66th chapter of Isaiah. In this chapter, the Lord speaks to two groups of servants. So, in Isaiah 66, verses 1 and 2, there are two groups. Brothers and sisters. And then it says, the servants up to the first servants are pointing to the servants up to the cleansing of the sanctuary, up to the judgment for the living, the purification of the church. So, the word up to meaning the boundary line. What will happen with this ministry fighting against each other and the contention of their trouble while they were fighting against each other is the headquarters. It says, up to the judgment for the living. The statement says, up to the judgment for the living, the cleansing of the sanctuary. So the statement up to the judgment for the living, cleansing of the sanctuary, so that cleansing of the sanctuary is no longer pertaining to the dead. Brothers and sisters, let's read again. Since the verse mentioned here is Daniel 8 verse 14. 1 TG 45:12. Now let us read the statement in track number 3 on page 53. Let's read. This startling revelation shows conclusively that the cleansing according to Daniel 8:14. What cleansing? Daniel 8:14 is first of the sanctuary in heaven and second of the sanctuary on earth. I think that statement is very plain that concerning Daniel 8:14, the cleansing of the sanctuary takes place first in heaven and then on earth. Now here in 1 TG number 45, page 12, it says, up to the judgment for the living, up to the cleansing of the sanctuary. What cleansing? Pertaining to the living. Remember, brothers and sisters, there is no separation among the congregation of the living, not until the cleansing of the sanctuary that pertains to the dead is finished. Let's read again the statement in 2SR 164. To SR page 164, it says, while the investigation for the congregation of the dead is in progress, there can be no separation among the congregation of the living. There is no separation among the congregation of the living. If the proceedings that pertains to the dead are still unfinished. So, the proceedings that pertains to the living takes place after the proceedings that pertains to the dead is finished. Now, this servant, according to this reading in 1 TG 45:12, their boundary line is only up to the time when all the names of the wicked, the unworthy names, brothers and sisters, will be blotted out in the Lamb's book of life. Now, brothers and sisters, it cannot be applied to the servants of the Seventh-day Adventist leadership. Why? Because in 1931, they were already rejected by God as His servants. God no longer recognized the Seventh-day Adventist leadership as God's servants since 1931. After the acceptable year of the Lord had been expired. And the only ministry, the only servants recognized by God at that time from 1931 onwards is the DSDA organization. Now let us read the statement here in Symbolic Code. So, to Symbolic Code number 10, page 6. To Symbolic Code number 10, page 6 and 7. To Symbolic Code. The foregoing statement simply means that God limited to the leaders of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination 1 year in which to accept the sealing message and to carry it to the church through the instrumentality of the old organization. And that if they still continued after the expiration of this limited period of grace to reject the message, he would spew them out of his mouth, rejects them as his servants, and that now, since this limited period of grace has expired, though they are demoted, if they should accept the message and desire to carry it to the laity, they must humble themselves by working in his appointed way, under messengers of his own choosing. To Symbolic Code number 10, page 6 and page 7. Now, brothers and sisters, ponder deeply. The statement is very plain. In 1931, God no longer recognized the Seventh-day Adventist leadership as his servants. It says, God rejects them as his servants. So to reject is indicating that God no longer recognized them as his servants. And the only channel of message, the message that cometh from heaven, is no longer channeled to the Seventh-day Adventist Church because they were rejected by God, but it was channeled to the this day organization. Now, it cannot be the servants in the Seventh-day Adventist leadership. The statement here in 1 TG 45:12. Why? Because they will be rejected by God at the time when the judgment for the living, blotting out of names under the congregation among the living, takes place. Their boundary line, it says, up to the cleansing of the sanctuary. Daniel 8:14, heavenly sanctuary. And what is the prediction given in the Bible 1,000 years ago? Even before this ministry, these servants were in existence, it was predicted beforehand that they will fighting against each other. They will, brothers and sisters, smiting against each other. And the bone of contention is headquarters. Now, the second proof that it could not be applied to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, brothers and sisters, let us read 1 SR. To repeat, brothers and sisters, the statement in the shepherd's rod made it so plain that the boundary line of these servants is at the time when the sanctuary in heaven will be completely cleansed. Now, I would like to read first tract number 3. Tract number 3 on page 50. It says, page 50 and 51. As the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary is a work of cleansing, the books by blotting from them the names of both the backslider and the tares. So what is the cleansing that pertains to the heavenly sanctuary? Blotting out of names. The unworthy names. That is why here in tract number 3, on page 73 and page 74, it says, being the Day of Atonement, tract number 3, page 73 and 74, being the Day of Atonement in type for both the dead and the living, this service of the earthly tabernacle therefore projects the Day of Atonement in its antitype, the cleansing of the sanctuary in heaven from unworthy names in the books and the cleansing of the church on earth from its unconverted and unstable members, thus bringing the time of clean books, clean church, and clean people. These three are in consecutive order. First, clean books, and then clean church, and then clean people. So, it must be the books to be clean first. So, the first thing to be cleansed are the books in the heavenly sanctuary. And then after all the books have been completely cleansed, then the second is the church must be cleansed. And then after the church had been cleansed, the saints themselves must be cleansed. Three different periods of time. But I would like to focus first to the first period, the cleansing of the sanctuary in heaven. Because to cleanse the church and to cleanse the saints, these two cleansing takes place on the earth, not in heaven. But we already read in tract number 3, page 53, that as far as Daniel 8, verse 14 is thus concerned, the cleansing in the heavenly sanctuary precedes the cleansing on the earthly sanctuary, or takes place first in heaven before on earth. It cannot be applied to the Seventh-day Adventist Church leadership because they were rejected in 1931. But in 1931, the cleansing in the heavenly sanctuary is not yet finished. Whereas, brothers and sisters, the boundary line of this ministry by which they were fighting against each other is only up to the cleansing of the sanctuary, up to the purification of the church, up to the judgment for the living, the final day of atonement, the last and the final day of atonement, when all the unworthy names will be blotted out from the Lamb's Book of Life. So what does it mean, up to? Meaning, brothers and sisters, unless these people will humble themselves and repent before God, if they will continue speaking evil, fighting against each other, up to that day of atonement, their names will be blotted out. Now, I would like to read 1 SR page 60. It says, change of names. Both Esau and Jacob represent two sinful classes. It says, Esau by the color of his skin and Jacob by his name. The names of both were changed. Jacob because he coveted something worthwhile. Esau being because of lust. Jacob's name meant deceiver. The name Esau in Hebrew, Heri, which symbolically would be honored, as previously explained, means he that finishes. Note the remarkable meaning of the name, signifying the class given the privilege to finish the work. Now, who are they, the angel of Laodicea, that have been given the privilege to finish the work? Is it the leadership of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the typical Laodicea? Now let us read the Shepherd's Rod. 2TG number 15 on page 6. It says, thus it was that the first Advent movement was reorganized and renamed Seventh-day Adventist. The Seventh-day Adventist organization, therefore, will not finish the work. Why? Because according to White House Recruiter, let us read. On page 22. The next decisive point of truth is that the judgment of the dead was to be proclaimed to many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. Revelation 10 verse 11. Mark the word many, it nevers all, never means every. Since this verse of scripture foretells the expansion of the 9th hour group and message, who are the 9th hour group? That is the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now let us read 2SR 200. Let us read 233. Mark the following point with care. From the 9th hour in 1844. So when does the 9th hour, brothers and sisters, commence? 1844. So 1930 could not be 9th hour. And in this study, we would like to show to you, brothers and sisters, that 1930 is the 10th hour. The antitypical Laodicea. What does it mean by the word Laodicea? People declaring judgment. So that's what it means by the name Laodicea according to Answerer number 1, page 11. Lau and Diki. People declaring judgment. And no one can deny the fact that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they are the people declaring the judgment that pertains to the dead. And no one can deny the absolute fact that the Davidian, they are the people declaring the judgment that pertains to the living. So we have typical Laodicea and antitypical Laodicea. But, brethren, whether you believe it or not, but the Word of God made it so plain that the last section of the Laodiceans is worse in reality than the first section. Let's read 2SR page 93. Since the history of the church is such, and the last section, Laodiceans, is in a worse condition. Brethren, if you will only obey the grammatical rule. You remember the statement in 2SR page 118 saying, this grammatical rule is followed in the scriptures and it is one way to recognize present truth. One way to recognize present truth, you need to obey the grammatical rule. In Old Symbolic Code, it says, let me read to you. It says, 3 Symbolic Code, number 7, page 4. 3 Symbolic Code, number 7, page 4. It says, you yourself know that such careless and thoughtless interpretations, which pay no attention to language, and which obey neither rule nor logic, are not inspired, but are private, and thus inevitably false. Whatever interpretation, whatever explanation by which they did not pay attention to the language or grammatical rule, it is false. Inevitably false. And that is private interpretation. In 1 Isaiah 244, it says, it is wonderful to note the inspiration of the scriptures. Perfect they are when their appointed time is come. Only at such an occasion are the scriptures grammatically correct. Now, if this statement, brothers and sisters, would be grammatically correct, then that is the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy. What does it mean by the word worse? The word worse is an adjective. An adjective, there are 3 degrees of comparisons. The first degree is, brothers and sisters, it's called positive degree. The second degree is comparative degree. And the last degree is superlative degree. The word worse is comparative degree. What is the positive degree of the word worse? Bad. So, I would like to show to you, brothers and sisters. So, these are the 3 degrees of comparison. In adjective, 3 degrees of comparison. In adjective, the first degree is bad. That is positive degree. It is called positive degree. Brothers and sisters. And next is worse. That is comparative degree. And then the last degree is worse. That is called superlative degree. Superlative degree. Brethren, this second degree worse is used only to compare 2 objects. Superlative degree is used to compare at least 3 or more than 3 objects. But in grammatical rule, worse, which is comparative degree, is strictly used to compare only 2 objects. Now, the degree of comparison used by the words of inspiration is in comparative degree. Therefore, it must be applied only to 2 Laodiceans, the typical and antitypical Laodicea, by which the last section, of course, the last section is antitypical Laodicea. Whether you will accept it or not, this is the reality. The situation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is bad. But the situation among the Bedia is worse. Can you imagine, brothers and sisters, professing to be Shepherd's Rod believer, fighting against each other, smiting their fellow servants, by which the bone of contention in reality has no connection at all to the present truth, no connection at all to the plan of redemption. A waste of time. Brothers and sisters, and that's what the devil wants, that their time would be wasted, or to divert their attention to the present truth. Now, I would like to read again here in 2SR page 93 and page 94. Since the history of the church is such, and the last section, open and close parenthesis, Laodiceans, so it is the last sections of the Laodiceans, is in a worse condition. Is it the first section? No. Because the word worse is a comparative degree used to compare 2 objects. And what are the 2 objects? Typical Laodicea and antitypical Laodicea. Therefore, in this reading, we can easily discern that typical Laodicea, their condition is bad. Yes, bad. Very bad. But the condition of the antitypical Laodiceans is worse. Well, that is not my word. It is the shepherd's rod who declared it. Now, in General Conference Special, the degree of comparison that had been used is superlative degree. So, let's read General Conference Special, page 23. It says, what is more, should God send another than Elijah, that is, someone with a message other than of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, he will not claim to be the Elijah. So, that is the statement. He will not lie. At the same time, brothers and sisters, if God sent antitypical Elijah, that is by, he will not lie also. Now, and he will not disclaim to say that he was not antitypical Elijah. If he is the antitypical Elijah that is by, that had been sent by God, and then he will say that he was not, then he is lying. Brothers and sisters. But if God would send any messenger other than Elijah, now the question, will God send another messenger other than Elijah? There is no such prophecy. The prophecy is that it is antitypical Elijah that is by the last of the prophets that God will send to the world. Then it says, hence, for anyone to make the claim that he is the Elijah, but bear another message, it says, but bear another message than that of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Think it thoroughly, brothers and sisters. What is the great and dreadful day of the Lord? This reading, brothers and sisters, is plainly telling us that antitypical Elijah that is by, he must have a particular work that had been committed by God unto him. What is that particular work? The day of slaughter. Let us read tract number 8. Page 61. It says, therefore, the work of Elijah particularly typifies the day of slaughter in the church. So that is the specific work why God sent antitypical Elijah that is by is to declare the day of slaughter. Now, if you claim that you are the antitypical Elijah that is by, that God had sent, but you did not know the day of slaughter, and instead, you are studying another subject rather than the particular object in view, the day of slaughter. I am not saying that that is the only message of antitypical Elijah that is by. Or I am not saying that the message of the last servant that God will send is only the day of slaughter. But that is one of the concrete evidence, impregnable proof that you can recognize the last servant, the last prophet that God will send, because unto him will be bestowed the knowledge concerning the day of slaughter. So the statement, evil and wicked servant, who are they? Those who are not aware of the slaughtering in Ezekiel chapter 9. Now let us read again the statement in tract number 1. On page 30. So let us read again the statement. track number 1, page 30. Joy, mourning, and woe. And lo, a roll of a book was therein, and he spread it before me, and it was written within and without. And there was written therein lamentations and mourning and woe. Ezekiel 2, verse 9 and 10. Thy right in Bisijing the slaughter in Ezekiel 9. Why is it that there are lamentations, mourning, and woe? It says, and the woes pronounced in the master's parables, the Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of. Aware of what? The slaughter, thy right in Bisijing, the slaughter in Ezekiel 9. Whose work is that? To announce the day of slaughter. The work of antitypical Elijah the Tishbite. So brothers and sisters, I think the woes, brothers and sisters, is pointing to those who reject, to those who fight against the message, as well as to those who claim of being inspired, while in reality, they were not sent by God. Now, I would like to read General Conference Special, page 23. It says, I would like to read again. Hence, for anyone to make the claim that he is the Elijah, but bear another message than that of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. But we already read concerning the great and dreadful day of the Lord is even more directly applied, brothers and sisters, to the day of slaughter. We call it the material side, although the spiritual side is directly applied to the blotting out of names. These two information that was given by God, brothers and sisters, is the living proof. Brothers and sisters, the identification bestowed by God that you can discern who is he, the antitypical Elijah that is by, because he will announce the blotting out of names, the final blotting out of names, as well as the day of his slaughter. Anything, brothers and sisters, that claim that they are the messengers sent by God, by which in reality they have no knowledge when the blotting out of names and the day of his slaughter is in itself positive proof that he is not a prophet of God at all, but a rank of imposter. And if any should tell you that a former prophet has fulfilled the promise, although the prophet himself, what is the word himself? Masculine in gender. What is the declaration by the shepherd's rod if the gender is masculine? Let us read. Track number 5, page 59. It says, moreover, the star is personified as him, masculine in gender, thus being limited to a male person. If the gender use is masculine, the application must be limited only to a male person. So this statement cannot be applied to Sister White. Otherwise, the Word of God is grammatically incorrect. But God is infallible God. All His works spell perfection, even to one jot or one tittle. 1 SR 232. As God is infallible, His works spell perfection, even to one jot or one tittle. God cannot be mistaken. Now, this is the statement given here in General Conference Special, page 23. It says, "And if any should tell you that a former prophet has fulfilled the promise, although the prophet himself has not said so, it is applied to Beti-Hotep. Although Beti-Hotep himself never declared that he was antitypical Elijah the Tishbite." So this statement was written even before the fulfillment would be in existence. And this is addressed to all the Bedians who say that antitypical Elijah the Tishbite is Beti-Hotep, although Beti-Hotep himself has not said so. Then not to know for a certainty that such are not working for the God of Elijah, but for the devil, is Laodiceanism of the worst kind. The worst. There is no other that supersede the word worst, because worst is in a superlative degree. You see, brothers and sisters, it is applied to the shepherds and believers. Laodiceanism of the worst kind. Who are they? Those who say that antitypical Elijah the Tishbite is Beti-Hotep, although Beti-Hotep himself, the prophet himself, has not said so. Therefore, it can be applied to the typical Laodicean. Because who are they, the prophet that they recognize as the last prophet? Sister White. And the word himself is limited to a male person, cannot be applied to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the typical Laodiceans, because the grammar use is masculine. And since there are only two Laodiceans, the typical and the antitypical Laodiceans, this statement must be applied to the antitypical Laodiceans, because the gender use is masculine. According to the General Conference Special, page 23, and the Shepherd's says in tract number 5, page 59, that when the gender is used as masculine, it can only be applied to a male person. Unless if the gender is used is feminine, herself. But the absolute fact is that the gender use is masculine. And it can be applied only to all shepherds and believers who are teaching that Beti-Hotep is the antitypical Elijah the Tishbite, while Beti-Hotep himself, the prophet himself, has not said so. Laodiceanism of the worst kind. And they were not working for the God of Elijah. They were working for the devil. That is the statement in General Conference Special, page 23. So, we have plenty of proofs to prove that the messages is addressed to the this day leadership, the Davidian organizations. To repeat again the statement in 1 SR on page 60, brothers and sisters, Edom must be applied to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But the name Esau, what is the name Esau according to 1 SR page 60? It is to the angel of Laodicea that had been given the privilege to finish the work. Does the privilege to finish the work had been given to the Seventh-day Adventist Church? No. Because God declared, you will prophesy only to many nations. And Beti-Hotep says, the word many never means all. White House Recruiter, page 22 and 23. And the Shepherd's Rod made it so plain in 2 TG 15:6. The Seventh-day Adventist organization, therefore, will not finish the work. So the only group of people by which they have been given the privilege to finish the work, if they had been faithful, the Davidian. Brothers and sisters. Now, well, prophecy never fails to tell the truth. In tract number 12, page 57, it says, prophecy the more sure word of prophecy, never fails to tell the truth. That even before we were born, it was predicted beforehand. Who are they? The servant in Matthew 24, verse 48, 49, 50, and 51. They are the servants by which they were not represented by the hypocrites. Who are they, the hypocrites? The 7 heads of the leopard-like beast, 2SR 101. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church, being one of the 7 heads, represent the hypocrites. Brothers and sisters, because we are talking about Matthew 25, 10 virgins. The 10 virgins, brothers and sisters. Now, ponder deeply, my dear brothers and sisters. So let us enumerate now one by one. 1TG 45, page 12, saying that this ministry, these servants, their boundary line is up to the judgment for the living, or the cleansing of the sanctuary in the congregation among the living. Is it the Seventh-day Adventist Church? No. Why? Because the Seventh-day Adventist Church, their boundary line ended in 1931. But 1931 is not the judgment for the living. If the judgment for the living commenced in ended in 1931, brothers and sisters, supposed to be God's people, 2 years from that date, they will be in the kingdom. And secondly, Betty Hotep never teach that 1931 is the commencement of the judgment for the living. He himself declared clearly in Answerer number 1, page 94, in 95, that he has no knowledge, either exact or approximate, the commencement of the judgment of the living. And in tract number 3, page 43, it says that the investigative judgment of the living obviously is yet future. And it was written in 1934. So that servants mentioned in 1TG 45, page 12, which is the servants in Matthew 24, verse 48 to 51, cannot be the Seventh-day Adventist leadership, but rather to the Davidian, by which their boundary line is up to the last and the final day of atonement. The cleansing of the sanctuary in the congregation of the living. And this is the reason why we are proclaiming this message, to escape such tremendous event, blotting out of names. That if possible, our names will be retained in the Lamb's Book of Life. What is the second proof that it cannot be applied to the Seventh-day Adventist leadership? Because they have been given the privilege to finish the work. And it was not given to the Seventh-day Adventist leadership, only to the Davidian. The privilege to finish the work, if they had been faithful. But it was predicted beforehand that they will smite against each other. And that is what really happening today. You can see it in actuality on Facebook. How they fight against each other. Now let us focus to our attention to that predicted event, when Jesus Christ will come and visit the earth. Let's go back again to 11 symbolic code, number 12, on page 11. It says, Matthew 25, verse 1. This verse begins with the word then. indicating that it takes place at the time the Lord comes, is spoken of in the preceding verse. What is the preceding verse? Verse 51. It did not say preceding verses. What is verse 51? Let us go back again. That is parable. Matthew 24 verse 51. It says, and shall cut him asunder, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. What is the portion of the hypocrites? All their names will be blotted out in the Lamb's book of life. In other words, the servants represented by the hypocrites and the servant in Matthew 24 verse 48, all of them have the same destiny. Their names will be blotted out. Now, for example, I would like to read to you Answerer. Number 3. On page 5 and 6. So while there is need of cleansing the earthly sanctuary from backsliders and hypocrites, there is need of cleansing the heavenly sanctuary from the sinners' names, its books. From the sinners' names in its books. And the proper term for such a work is investigative judgment. The work portrayed in Daniel's prophecy and in Christ's parable of the harvest, net, talents, wedding garment, and the goats and the sheep. How many parables of Jesus Christ mentioned here? The parable of the harvest, the parable of the net, the parable of the talents, the parables of the wedding garment, and the parables concerning the goats and the sheep. Pointing to what? To blotting out of names. It says, the cleansings from the names in its books. That is, blotting out of names, brothers and sisters. Now, let us go back again to the reading. In 11 Symbolic Code, number 12, page 11. It says, this verse begins with the word then, indicating that it takes place at the time the Lord comes as spoken of in the preceding verse. So, the coming of Christ takes place after the blotting out of names. Then it says, the kingdom shall be likened to something. The kingdom of God as a crown kingdom does not exist today, as you know. Then what is meant here by the kingdom? It is referring to the people that are candidates for citizenship in it. Who are the subjects for the kingdom of God? They are not the church. Then the people comprising the church of God shall be likened unto 10 virgins. Now, brothers and sisters, the 10 virgins, so let us read Christ's object lesson. Christ's object lesson, page 411. The class represented by the foolish virgins are not hypocrites. So, Christ's object lesson, page 411. So, we need to understand that whoever the foolish virgins, they are not the hypocrites. So the hypocrites represent the heads of the leopard-like beast, 2SR101. So the foolish virgins cannot be applied to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Why? Because the Seventh-day Adventist Church, brothers and sisters, is a part of the seven heads. And the seven heads, brothers and sisters, on the leopard-like beast, they are called the hypocrites. But the foolish virgins, they are not the hypocrites. And we will show to you, brothers and sisters, that in this illustration, half and half cannot be applied to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Because if you will be saying that the five foolish virgins and the five wise virgins, they are represented half and half, then at least the membership throughout the whole world is only 300,000. But the Seventh-day Adventist is already 28 million. If that is half and half, so the wise virgins must be 14 million. It cannot be. The shepherd's rod made it so plain that the wise virgins, they are 144,000. That is very plain. And not only one passage, more than three. Or I would like to say at least three. And we can establish the truth by three witnesses. Now, here in 2SR, let us read, brothers and sisters. 2SR page 182. It says, thus again it proves that the 144,000 are the five wise virgins. 2SR 182. Thus again it proves that the 144,000, they are the wise virgins. Now, here's another statement in 1SR. Let's read the statement given by the shepherd's rod. It says, 1SR page 30. It says, this means the denomination will be divided in half and suggests the 10 virgins, 5 of whom were wise and 5 were foolish. In other words, half and half. One SR page 30. That is the illustration of the Bible, half and half. And it says in tract number 3, page 65, Christ's illustrations are perfect. The illustration of Jesus Christ are perfect. Tract number 3, page 65. If the illustration is half and half, therefore it cannot be applied to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Well, it is applied in the days of B.T. Hotep, but that is not the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy. Why? Because in 1930, the membership of the Seventh-day Adventist Church at that time are more than 300,000. But that is only the groundwork. So that we could understand that when the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy, it must be pointing to the entire 12 tribes of Israel, spiritual Israel, by which half of them are 144,000 foolish virgins and half of them are 144,000 wise virgins. Half and half. I would like to read first track number 5. We have already that. And track number 5. Supposed to be, I would like to say supposed to be, of all the Bereans, the Bayesian movement will be the one to accept this statement because this reading material, track number 5, was printed and published by them. Now let us read track number 5, page 112 and 113. But let us go to page 113, saying, this makes the 7,000 So let us read. It says, this makes the 7,000 slain figurative of the unrighteous, that tares therein. Plainly, the 10th part stands for the church which is first purified, in which the bad, the tares, are separated from the good, the wheat. Obviously, therefore, the city is in this instance a representation of the Christian world, Christendom, as a whole, of which the 10th part is God's first fruit part, and the remaining 9/10 are His second fruit. Second fruit part, the first from the Laodicea and the second from Babylon. 9/10. Who are they, the 10th part? Brothers and sisters, well, we will discuss that on our subject, the numbering of the saints. Maybe, if you are interested, we will explain that on the numbering of the saints. Of course, the 10th part, 10th, the statement is very plain. Let us distinctly separate the eraser. Now, brothers and sisters, let us distinctly separate 10 parts and 10th part. If you will say 10 parts divided into 10. And if you will say 10th part, that is the last. So the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seven, 8, 9, and then 10. The 10th. So in order for us to understand the remaining 9 parts, we need to understand, brothers and sisters, the 10 parts and the 10th part. And the statement is found Revelation 11:13. Now let us read track number 5. Track number 5. On page let's read. Track number 5, page 112. 113. Climaxing the event symbolized the remnant were uprighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. None but those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ can truly fear and give glory to Him. Accordingly, in the present connection, the remnant is necessarily figurative of the righteous, the wheat, in that part of the city which fell. So, the city, what happened to the city? It was fallen. It says, in that part of the city which fell. What had been fallen? The city. And the part of the city, it says, they are the wheat. Who are they the wheat? In 1 SR 228. The wheat represents the 144,000. Who are they the wheat? The 144,000. Now, then it says, in page 113, this makes the 7,000 slain figurative of the unrighteous that tares therein. Hence, the 10th part stands for the church, which is first purified, in which the bad, the tares, are separated from the good, the wheat. Obviously, therefore, the rest of the city, in this instance, is a representation of the rest of the Christian world, Christendom as a whole. To repeat again, we will discuss that on the subject, the numbering of the saints. Let us go back to our subject concerning the parable in Matthew 25. What is the parable in Matthew 25? There is a delay. There is a delay. Does William Miller and his associates experience delay? If you believe the shepherd's rod, then, and not only to believe the shepherd's rod, but that is the reality. Let us read in 11 Symbolic Code number 12, page 9. Let us read the statement. I suppose you would say that they were the Millerites. But this I cannot agree because there was no delay for them. They had set the date for Christ's coming, and the outcome for them was not a delay but a bitter disappointment. 11 Symbolic Code number 12, page 9. There was no delay for them. Do you believe that statement, that the Millerites movement, there was no delay? Because disappointment is not a delay. And delay is not a disappointment. Because delay is only a postponement. Now, I would like to read the statement in 11 Symbolic Code. Number 12. On page 13. The cry to meet the bridegroom comes after the time of tarrying. So I would like to read again, 11 Symbolic Code, number 12, page 13. The cry to meet the bridegrooms comes after the time of tarrying. Now let us now study closely. What is the tarrying time? The cry saying, behold, the bridegroom cometh, is after the time of tarrying. That is the statement, 11 Symbolic Code, number 12, page 13. Therefore, we need to study what is the tarrying time. Now, let us read the shepherd's rod. 2SR 113. Let's read. 2SR page 181 and 182. But I would like to read verse 182. If the foregoing application is correct, then at the end of the tarrying period, or just prior to the commencement of the judgment of the living. So, the tarrying period ended before the commencement of the judgment of the living. So, let us make an illustration so that we could understand. Tarrying period. So, this is the tarrying period. Tarrying period. What is the statement given by the shepherd's rod? The tarrying period ended. So let us put here, ended. The word ended meaning finished. Or another term, close. The tarrying period ended just prior to the commencement of the judgment of the living. So, just prior. So there must be intervening time. Before the commencement of the judgment of the living, the tarrying period ended just prior. So let us put here, just prior. So what is the event here? Just before the commencement of the judgment of the living. Until, after the tarrying period ended. After the tarrying period ended, and just before the commencement of the judgment of the living, what is the specific event between the time when the tarrying period ended and before the commencement of the judgment of the living? But this one thing is sure, as stated by the shepherd's rod in 2SR 182. The tarrying period ended just prior to the commencement of the judgment of the living. Let us read again the statement here in 2SR 182. 2SR page 182, it says, if the foregoing application is correct, then at the end of the tarrying period, at the end, or just prior to the commencement of the judgment of the living, there must be a message cry. So what is the intervening time? When the tarrying period ended, just prior to the commencement of the judgment of the living, the midnight cry. The proclamation, behold, the bridegroom cometh. I would like to read this reading, brothers and sisters, in early writings. Early writings, page 246. Early writings, page 246. It says, without the preaching of definite time for the coming of Christ, the work design of God would not have been accomplished. Now, I would like to read again, early writings, page 246. Without the preaching of definite time for the coming of Christ, the work design of God would not have been accomplished. What is the work design of God?
by which that work, design of God, it will never be accomplished without the preaching of definite time for the coming of Christ. I think even if you will call any English teacher, that statement is very plain. The statement is very plain that without the preaching of definite time, without this preaching, the definite time for the coming of Christ, the work design of God would not have been accomplished. It is very important now to understand what is the work design of God, that in order for that work design of God to be accomplished, there must be a preaching of definite time. Because without that preaching of definite time concerning the definite time of Christ's coming, the work design of God will never be accomplished, will never accomplish. And in order for that design or work design of God, in order for that work design of God, there must be a preaching of definite time of Christ coming. Now, we will no longer elaborate definite time because the word definite time, that is definite. The things that we need to elaborate is only these two things. What coming of Christ? And what is the work design of God? That in order for that work design of God to be accomplished, there must be a preaching of Christ's definite coming. The definite, there must be a preaching of definite time. That is not my words. That is the word of the Spirit prophecy. Do you believe the Spirit prophecy? Then you need to believe that statement. That without the preaching of definite time of Christ's coming, without that preaching, the work, design of God will never be accomplished. In order for the work which is design of God to be accomplished, there must be a preaching of definite time. What definite time? Of Christ's coming. But what Christ coming? Visible, invisible. What is our subject? Matthew 24, Matthew 25. Brothers and sisters, now let's read the statement in 2SR. Page 184. Page 184. It says, Matthew 24, 184. Matthew 24, verse 36, verse 50 are description of the same event. Watch therefore, for ye know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh. You know, brothers and sisters, the shepherd says, this has reference to the time of the judgment and not of his coming to earth. For the saints shall know the day and hour of Christ's coming in the clouds to receive the redeemed, as it shall be announced by the Father shortly before his coming. Let us go back again to the statement in track number 1, page 30. What is the who pronounced by the Master in the parable? It is to that servant by which they are not aware of the slaughtering. thy right in besieging the slaughter in Ezekiel 9. And the words pronounced by the Master is pointing to those ministry by which they have no knowledge concerning the day of slaughter. What is the day of slaughter? Executive judgment. What is the statement in 2SR 184? The coming mentioned in Matthew 24, verse 36 and verse 50. And Matthew 25, verse 1 to 13. It says, this has reference to the judgment. The judgment is divided into two, investigative and executive. But brothers and sisters, investigative and executive first applied to the proceedings in the heavenly sanctuary. Let us distinctly separate the investigative judgment takes place on earth and the executive judgment that takes place on earth, and the investigative judgment and the executive judgment that takes place in the heavenly sanctuary. The investigative judgment and executive judgment that takes place in the heavenly sanctuary is the spiritual side. Only book work. But the investigative judgment and executive judgment that takes place on earth, that is actual bodily separation. 1 TG 11:6 and 1 TG 45:10. Actual bodily separation. Now, let's go back again to the statement. Without the preaching of definite time of Christ's coming, the work, design of God will never be accomplished. We will continue the subject, brothers and sisters, but I would like to read first. The Great Controversy, 392. Let's read. 392 and 393. It says, 392. No one, however, then noticed that an apparent delay in the accomplishment of the vision at tarrying time is presented in the same prophecy. Let us read again. It says, Great Controversy 392. No one, however, did notice that an apparent delay in the accomplishment of the vision at tarrying time is presented in the same prophecy. So it says here, brothers and sisters, what is represented by tarrying time? Delay. Is there any delay in the experience of the Millerites movement? The shepherds had made it so plain. No, there was no delay. Brothers and sisters, but rather a bitter disappointment. And that is why the Shepherd's Heart says that the experience of the Millerites is contrary to the proper application of the parable. It says here in 2SR 181 and 182, 2SR 181 182, I would like to read a statement. Note that they slumbered and slept before the cry was made. So, before the cry was made, both the foolish and wise virgins, they were sleeping. Then it says, In the summer of 1844, midway between the time when it was first thought that the 2,300 days would end and the second date, October 22 of the same year, this period be applied as being the tarrying time. But mark that the cry had been going on for some years, the message by Miller. What is the cry? The message by Miller. So the cry is pointing to the message proclaimed by the messenger. And the tarrying time was applied at its close after they had discovered their miscalculation, which is contrary to a proper application of the parable. You see, it is contrary to the proper application of the parable, because what is the proper application of the parable? They set the date, but it was delayed. Then, when it was delayed, brothers and sisters, according to the parable, both the wise virgins and the foolish virgins, they were asleep. And while they were sleeping, there is a message, the midnight cry. When does the midnight cry will be proclaimed? At the end of the tarrying period. So we need not to establish when does the tarrying period will be ended. Here in 2SR 182 it says, therefore the tarrying time must be the judgment for the dead. What is the tarrying time? The judgment for the dead. If you will be saying judgment for the dead, where is the proceedings? Holy place. So it commenced in October 22, 1844. So it cannot be applied to William Miller because it is contrary to the proper application of the parable. Tarrying time must be in the period judgment for the dead. And it commenced in October 22, 1844. And secondly, there was no delay in the experience of William Miller, but rather bitter disappointment. So it must be pointing to God's people in the last generation of men, by which they set the date, but it was delayed. But at the end of the tarrying period, what is the tarrying period? Judgment for the dead. Meaning, on the last and final day of atonement, blotting out of names that pertains to the dead, at that time, when it was finished, then there is a message, brothers and sisters. There is a message proclaiming that the tarrying period has ended, meaning the judgment that pertains to the dead is closed. The judgment that pertains to the dead is finished. Then the judgment for the living is in progress. We will continue this subject, brothers and sisters, in our next episodes. And to repeat again, the Spur prophecy made it so plain that without the preaching of a definite time of Christ's coming, the work, design of God will never be accomplished. So, to repeat again, definite time must be definite. Did William Miller and his associates preach the definite time of Christ's coming? Yes. But what is the result of their preaching? Disappointment. Great disappointment. That is not the fulfillment of the prophecy, because there must be a group of people by which they preach the definite time. But in the perfect fulfillment of the prophecy, what is the definite time that they preach? By which, in that period of time, they were preaching the definite time of Christ's coming. Christ's coming of what? Christ's invisible coming. Concerning the judgment. But, when they were preaching the definite time of Christ's coming, pertaining to the judgment, in the period, before the tarrying period ended, they discovered their miscalculations. And that is called, brothers and sisters, delay. They experienced delay. But at the end of the tarrying period, brothers and sisters, in order for God to accomplish the work, design of God, there must be a preaching of definite time of Christ's coming pertaining to Matthew 25, pertaining to Ezekiel 1, pertaining to Malachi 3, verse 1 to 3. We'll continue this subject in our next episode. May the good Lord bless you and have a beautiful, wonderful evening.